everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. We're excited to be back with you this month. We have a really fun show and program for you today. I think you will enjoy it. A little bit of history, a pretty significant special guest, and of course, Jill and I being together with you is always a highlight, isn't it? No. Anyways, we are excited to continue to bring our monthly podcast to you, where we focus on trying to illustrate and advance the idea that people with different perspectives coming together in relationship and conversation is a better way to deal with our differences than just kind of being argumentative and contentious with one another. So excited to have you back with us on Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. So today we have had a special opportunity through the organization that Jill and I bring leadership to, called Standing Together, to host a very special guest from Denver, Colorado. He has been with us yesterday and today here in Salt Lake City to talk about a very special book that was co-authored and written and published 27 years ago. So we're going to be talking about How Wide the Divide, a Mormon and an Evangelical in Conversation, a landmark book that was published, like I said, 27 years ago in 1997, as a first of its kind, where a very, very prominent LDS scholar at Brigham Young University and a very, very highly regarded evangelical scholar from Denver Theological Seminary formed a friendship and ended up writing a book about their relationship and about their theological similarities and differences. And because of that, it kind of really started a whole new genre of interaction. And so we're going to look back and look forward at what that book has contributed to the ongoing relationship between communities that we care deeply about, the evangelical community and the LDS community. So, Jill, are you excited about our program today?
I'm excited. We're excited to have Craig Blomberg here with us today. And he has been a great friend for many years, and we'd love to introduce him to you.
Dr. Blomberg, Dr. Craig Blomberg, welcome to Building Bridges with Greg and Jill.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we start a long time ago, our friendship. I was a freshman entry-level seminary student in 1989, moving and relocating from beautiful Santa Barbara, California, where Jill and I both attended college at Westmont, and moved into an apartment and registered for classes, and off I was to preparing for full-time ministry. And you were then a younger professor. I know you were there a few years before that. But your background, we'd love to you just kind of tell us a little bit about who you are and your area of study and your family life, just anything that can help us to get to know you a little bit better before we get into the subject of the day.
That was a while back, wasn't it? I am a native of Western Illinois. I went to college and seminary in Illinois, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Met the woman who would become my wife there. And then in a pre-internet world, we went off to Aberdeen, Scotland for a 3-year honeymoon, also known as PhD studies. I got my first teaching job at Palm Beach Atlantic in South Florida, and then we moved to Denver in 1986, and I've been stuck in a rut. Been there ever since, 35 years full-time, 2.5 years now part-time in retirement. We had 2 daughters. We now have 3 grandchildren. I know that's not much by some people's standards, but it's all we've been able to manage. And we've had a chance to travel the world, spoken on every continent except Antarctica, and I don't really need to go there. I'm a bit of a writeaholic. I've spent way too much time writing books and articles, but I love it, and delighted to be here with you guys.
We did ask you, and you let us know that you have published 30 books, correct, as a single author?
20 as a single author, and then another 10 either as co-author or co-editor or in collaboration with somebody.
And some of those titles, I mean, you've done a number of commentaries on New Testament books. How many of those have you done?
Done Matthew and 1 Corinthians and James, and then have done a couple of textbooks that span the entire New Testament and include like mini commentaries on each book within within the New Testament.
Yeah. You actually, for our audience sake, one of the great contributions I think you have made in New Testament studies and in your area of interest and research is in the whole veracity of the New Testament Gospels themselves with the historical reliability. And that's an area that you lecture on and speak on to this day all over, because there's been many attacks on the veracity of the New Testament and the Gospel accounts, and you've made a great defense that these are historically reliable documents. Is just comment a little bit about that book.
It's
and
the
what
very first book I published in 1987, not very creatively entitled Historical Reliability of the Gospels, but it's something I've come back to in 2016 that got expanded to Historical Reliability of the New Testament, a bigger book. And as I think about the many topics that people invited me in churches and colleges and other places to talk about, that probably is the one that slightly more than any other topic people keep asking about.
I think it would be great to add, too, just that he's worked with the NIV translation a bit. And when I've talked to you all about the Bible studies that I'm writing, and whenever I get stuck on something, I'll send Craig a message, and he's very quick to send me a response. And so I've learned a lot. I've never taken a class. I'd love to take a class with you sometime. Maybe that will be in the future. But you've been so helpful for me as a friend and as a scholar to help with the Bible studies that I'm working on.
And you do your homework well enough that when I see an email coming with a question, I know this is something very special, that you've looked in other sources first, and probably somebody has come to you with an issue, with an opinion that is quite eccentric.
Yes, most of the times it's something I think, like, I have never heard that before. I wonder, in all of your travels and all your studies, have you heard this kind of thing before? And
I think one of those issues was
helpful.
when you dealt with the swaddling cloth of baby Jesus.
Yes, that was a big deal. You'll have to go check out the Multiply Goodness Bible study to see what that's all about. But I would love to get into, we talked at the beginning of the show when Greg introduced you about this book, How Wide the Divide, and your friendship with Stephen Robinson. We talk a lot on our podcast about building bridges with people that believe something different than you. And I think it's a wonderful story how the two of you got together. Would you share a little bit about that?
Well, that's Greg's fault. I mean, to his credit also, when he was close to graduation, he showed me a book that Robinson had recently published called Are Mormons Christians, and explained to me that this was kind of a blockbuster from Deseret at the time. I think it was published in 91, and would I ever consider some kind of a response to it? And what that led to was a panel discussion. We put on a special weekend evening program. The seminary packed out our chapel, which was also a multi-purpose room at the time. Even invited Robinson to come. He eventually declined, but in light of follow-up letters and conversation, it gave me a chance eventually to meet him at a conference with the Society of Biblical Literature, and we just found out that we were learning enough from each other that we had not realized was a significant part of our respective communities, that one day this idea emerged of some kind of a point-counterpoint book.
Was that an area that you were interested in before?
Only recreationally. My parents had friends where I grew up who were LDS. My wife had a niece who had married into an LDS family. And so twice in my life, I had been challenged to read through the Book of Mormon and pray about whether I believed it was from God. And so I took that very seriously, and I did read through Book of Mormon very carefully on two different occasions. But it's not like every year I kept coming back and studying it.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds like there was some seeds planted,
Right.
enough that when Greg approached you with that panel, that there was some interest.
Yeah.
Well, the joke always was that you were just minding your own business as a New
That's
Testament
right.
scholar.
That's right.
Creating and establishing your career and your writing focus when I interjected with this Mormon topic and the fascination that I had. I remember at the time that it was kind of getting out there that LDS missionaries were using Robinson's book, Are Mormons Christians, as kind of a, for anybody that would object to the idea that Mormonism wasn't historically a part of the traditional Christian culture or community, that they were using that. And I thought, boy, we need to have a response to this. We got some great minds here at Denver Seminary, and as a student body leader, I was able to, kind of work with the leadership team, and we created this event. But we were able to tap into your mind and Dr. Tim Weber from Church History and Dr. Vernon Grounds and Dr. Gordon Lewis, and this idea to have a panel theological kind of reaction response to Dr. Robinson's pretty lofty and thoughtful defense of how and why the LDS community deserved to be called a Christian community. That was kind of the point of it. That I felt that, boy, if we could get you on board and others, and ever since you've been kind of having this side gig called Mormon Evangelical or LDS Evangelical Dialogue. So, thanks for being willing to be sidetracked a little bit.
Well, I felt the Spirit was telling me to do it at the time, or I probably wouldn't have.
That would be a fascinating read. Do we have those papers from the panel somewhere? Or
well, I do know that the event was recorded and the video was lost.
Okay.
Oh.
So at this point, I don't know that we have anything other than, unless Denver Seminary has an archive of all recorded things on their campus.
Probably not.
But anyways, as the process started, it was unique because, again, for our audience sake, remember, this was 1992. This is over 30 years ago. And the great debate that was kind of emerging between the LDS and evangelical community was on the very definition of Christianity, that in the 80s, the 1980s, there was kind of a strong apologetic response to the growing impact of the LDS Church. And there were attack videos and materials that were produced that the LDS Church eventually felt that they needed to respond to because that was cultivating a negative image for them. And so I think when Stephen Robinson came out and Elder Wells wrote his book, Mormons Are Christians Because, a member of the General Authority 70, he wrote a book in 85. Then there was Robinson's book in 91. And so there was this kind of, hey, we have a right to call ourselves Christians. We believe we're Christians. And, these evangelicals are saying that we're not Christians, and we don't take kindly to that. So it became kind of an emotional and charged reaction. So we thought, what a great thing that he's written this book that we could respond to and answer the question, not from an emotional, negative, accusatory kind of point of view, but let's go counterpoint with the context, because I think he had things like the historical exclusion, the theological exclusion, the Trinity exclusion. There were certain chapters that I asked each of you as panelists to talk about. And we tried, like you said, very hard to get Dr. Robinson to come, and he was just that close. And for some of our audience that might be LDS, they would know that there used to be a Know Your Religion seminar that the LDS Church community would put out, and he was speaking in Sacramento, California. And one of the experiences that he had right before this decision was made was somebody kind of flippantly said to him, well, they're going to get you, they're going to eat you alive at Denver Seminary when you go speak there. And I was like, when he told me that, and he said, I think I will not be coming because obviously people know I'm coming to Denver Seminary already, and I haven't even committed to coming, and you guys are planning to eat me alive, and I said, no, we're not going to do that. That's crazy. I don't know why somebody would say that, but the die was cast, and he was not coming. So what we did is we presented an audio tape, a cassette tape of the dialogue to him afterwards. So there might be a cassette tape somewhere. I don't know. We'll try to find that out. And it took a number of months to get him to reply, but reply he eventually did. He sent a 7-page single single-spaced letter. For some of you, there used to be those kind of things, letters, where they actually wrote things down and sent them to each
Snail
other
mail.
with a stamp. But he, I want to get to this because there's a personal side to Dr. Robinson, who passed away about 3 years ago, correct? What year was?
20...
Roughly 2 to 3 years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
And as highly regarded and well known he is in the LDS Church, because he wrote one of the quintessential books of the last 30 years called Believing Christ, and it was highly purchased and published, just a bestseller for him. And it's just a wonderful book on grace. There's quite an emphasis on grace in that book. But all that to say is that there was an acerbic side to him, a little bit of a frosty, kind of tense side to Dr. Robinson. But in relationship to his letter, he was kind of big on you and not as big on the other three panelists. And when I sent the letter to all four of you, and he found out because you wrote and responded to his letter, he got really mad at me. He was like, "Why in the world did you send that to those four panelists? I did not give you permission." And I said, "Well, what did you think I wanted it for? I wanted them to be able to know what you thought about their presentation, vice versa, and I thought it would keep the conversation going." But we smoothed it out, but man, that was a tough one because he was pretty ticked off that I did that without formal permission. But I think God's hand was in it because your response to him was a continuing conversation and a continued open door, and then again, eventually you met. So on the personal side of your getting to know Stephen Robinson, did you have some of those kind of interesting experiences with his personality?
I can hardly say that I'd had exposure to the full swath of the LDS world in my life because never lived in Utah, never lived in a place where there was a huge LDS community, but I had a number of friends at different points in my life, and my sense was that the general profile was somebody who went out of their way to try to be friendly and courteous and put a positive spin on anything in life that others might take more negatively, and usually was healthy and into the cleanest living imaginable. And here was a guy who was quite overweight, even as a younger man. It turned out he had medical reasons for that. No blame attached. But he just shot from the hip and called a spade, and if he didn't like something, it didn't matter whether it was from his church, my church, or no church. Well, they don't know what they're talking about. Or, just like plenty of people in the world, but I just had never met a Latter-day Saint like that. So,
but that wasn't a turnoff to you? I mean, somehow you were able to overcome that and
no, I thought, they've got normal people in their community.
I'd love to know, are there certain things that you did specifically either during the panel or during your friendship with him that you feel were important to breaking down some of those walls so that you could have some of those deeper conversations that he felt comfortable with you?
Asking a lot of questions. I did not pretend to be an expert. I wasn't an expert. I wasn't an ex-Mormon. I wasn't somebody who had come out of any kind of a ministry to Latter-day Saint world. I knew what I knew from reading a few books, meeting a few people, and my walk through the Mormon scriptures. But he would say something, and I wouldn't fully understand what that entailed, and so I just asked a lot of questions. And like I hope I would do with anybody else who represented a viewpoint that I wasn't terribly an expert on. And I think just that alone impressed him, that he had a lot of stories that he would tell about how other people told him what he believed. And he would say, no, I don't believe that. And they would say, of course you do. You're a Latter-day Saint. This is as if there was some lockstep every person robotically exactly alike. Well, that's not true of any community, certainly not any large and at all diverse community.
Not any religion is monolithic to its membership. I mean, you can't say all Baptists believe, all Mormons believe, all
heavens.
Muslims believe. There's great diversity.
You might say everybody in Heaven's Gate in Southern California way back when believed, but then they might have had 40 members.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think that's a message that we can take into any relationship that we have, that we're curious about what they believe and genuinely interested. And, sometimes we're in situations where you actually have something else on your mind that you want to say, but getting rid of that distraction and really genuinely loving someone, asking the right questions to draw them out and understand who they are and what they really believe, to have genuine friendship. And I think that's where the power of the Holy Spirit comes in to really work in a relationship like that.
One of my favorite lines, and I've quoted it out of context in all kinds of other situations, out of context, but I don't think inappropriately. There were times when Stephen would say, "You can hear what I think and disagree. That's fine. You can hear what I think and you can say, that's foolish. Or, I don't see how anybody can believe that. But don't tell me that I'm lying when I tell you what I believe. I am the world's greatest expert on only one thing. But I think it's fair to say I am the world's greatest expert on what I personally believe, and nobody else knows it as well." Well, think of all the context you could use that in. I know your favorite food is fried chicken. No, it's not.
Were there certain things that Stephen believed that were different than what the Mormon Church would preach at that time?
Well, I wasn't enough of an expert to know what the church would preach at that time. I know what I had learned and been taught and what other individuals had told me they believed, and I knew that he was saying some things different than that. He was saying repeatedly, we are bound by the Old and New Testaments and the King James Version of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price. Those are our canonical works. You want to quote me something from the King Follett Discourse, from Lorenzo Snow, from the Journal of Discourses, from one of the later presidents of the church, I may be able to tell you that those things have been incredibly influential, but I am not bound as a Latter-day Saint to believe them. And in some cases, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Because of his weight and his health it deteriorating, we didn't get to stay in contact with him very much after the early 2000s. But in getting to know him as a student at Denver Seminary, as a young pastor here in Utah, what I really appreciated about him is while he was blunt and why he could be a little harsh, and colorful at times, there was a kind of endurance factor that he had. He didn't give up on people. And if you went the extra mile and you took the next step to say, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry I said it that way, but da-da-da-da," he didn't just kind of walk away and stay mad at you. He would kind of get over it, and you could continue the conversation with him. And we had multiple conversations. I remember one of my favorite moments with Stephen Robinson was after a presentation he made at BYU, and it was a conference, and there was a Q&A, and he was saying a certain amount of things about, dealing with doctrine and kind of evaluating kind of like how we know what we know and what we believe. And I pushed back on him in the audience, and I said, you almost kind of feel like there's an independence there. I said, if Brigham Young came in this room right now and told you as the prophet of the church what the church believed, I feel like there would be something different. And he said, "Well, Greg, if Brigham Young walked into this room right now and said what you're saying, I would say, Brother Brigham, you're wrong." And I said, you would dare to say that to the second prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ? He said, absolutely. And he said in front of an entirely LDS audience, because it was, like you said, it wasn't the canonical, it wasn't the core, it was a kind of a more peripheral thing that Brigham Young has. He had a lot of interesting things that he taught and said, and he was willing to say, I have no problem saying I would disagree with him on that issue. And it opened up a lot of, that kind of transparency, that vulnerability and that honesty is really appreciated in dialogue. I think if somebody always gives you the canned answer or the party line on everything, you think, come on, don't you have an independent thought? And Stephen Robinson was an independent thinker. He was a good, solid guy there. And, at the end of the day, I think some of his own pain, maybe attending Duke University where he got his PhD and being in the South, and I mean, he endured a lot of anti-Mormon persecution, probably. Yeah.
It took me a number of years beyond the time that How Wide the Divide was published, as we moved on to a much larger evangelical Mormon dialogue with scholars from both communities, and over 20 years, probably, I think I've counted up at least 30 people on each side that attended one meeting at some point, is that evangelicals need to think differently than we've been taught to think, which is, oh, you've got a new idea, Jill. How do you defend that in light of the Bible? Well, what did I just do? It's go back to the original sources. I would never say, I would never say. There might be somebody who would say, well, Jill, how do you defend that in light of John Piper? Or in light of Andy Stanley? Or in light of Francis Chan or some contemporary? We go, well, no, that's not our authority, as much as somebody might adore what their ministry has been. And it took me several years to get this idea that in the Latter-day Saint community, it is what people are saying in the present. It is what is coming from Salt Lake City now we're in 2024. President Russell Nelson, who have they ever had a centenarian president before? That would be a fabulous question, Greg, if somebody could ask President Nelson if Brigham Young walked in the room on one of these peripheral issues. Would the president of the living church be willing to say, no, I don't agree with that, Brigham. Let me tell you what's happened since you died.
Well, I think one of the fascinating things is a interim a president of the church between the two, President Ezra Taft Benson, once gave a message on the authority of the prophet. And he actually said a living prophet has more authority than a past prophet. So according to Ezra Taft Benson, he would give the authority to the current president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as opposed to a past one.
There's
So,
my answer.
so
Yeah.
Nelson would trump Young. Now, if there's any LDS person that's listening to this podcast and doesn't agree, please make a comment. Make your case.
Well, that would fall in line with their doctrine because it's modern day revelation.
Progressive revelation, current, yeah. So let's turn the corner a little bit. We talked about your relationship forming and whatnot. So at one point you met, you became acquainted. I love the little story about kind of going over and spending some time in Provo and him spending some time in Denver. Maybe you could tell that. And then how did you actually come to the point of saying, okay, let's write a book together?
We did each invite the other to come speak in some classes and public forum in each other's educational institutions. Did spend a couple of evenings in each other's homes. And then somewhere about 2 years into this friendship, Stephen took me completely by surprise and said, why don't you come and teach my classes at BYU for a semester? And I'll go teach your classes at Denver Seminary for a semester. And my first reaction is, you can't be serious. And my second reaction when I realized he was serious was, BYU wouldn't allow that, would they? Surely?
You'd both get fired, wouldn't you?
But then I didn't know. I knew that there were a handful of non-Mormon professors in departments outside of religion. So I honestly didn't know. And so I heard myself saying, when you ever have that experience, you answer and it's like, oh, is that what I'm saying? What I heard myself saying was, well, that's an amazing and wonderful offer. I would love to take you up on that. But I have to say, sadly, that because of our doctrinal statement at Denver Seminary, and even despite the things that we've discovered we agreed on that we thought we didn't, there still are enough issues that I know you would not be able to sign our statement of faith. And then, without really having any idea what I was saying, I don't want to attribute to the Spirit everything I say, or I have no idea what I'm saying. But on this occasion, I like to think that he was giving me the words. I said, what about some kind of a joint writing project?
At least as a starting point.
At least as a starting point. And he jumped at it. He said, what do you have in mind? I said, I don't know. I just thought of the idea. But then that conversation got pursued.
And so as you began to, think about the idea, how did the book begin to shape itself? And how did you come up with how you were going to write this joint project?
Just throwing out a lot of ideas, throwing out the idea we don't want it to sound just like a formal debate, which often has, opening statements, rejoinders, all this stuff that's formulaically laid out. We wanted to be able to share what we had learned about the others movement and the breadth of allowable diversity in one another's communities. We also didn't want to pull any punches. We didn't want this to be, let's talk about everything we can agree on and be nice to each other on and leave all the most controversial and difficult topics to one side. We didn't want it to, even when we disagreed on something, be peripheral rather than central issues. And so that led to, and we didn't want it to be huge. We wanted it to be something people might read. And so we finally decided on 4 main topics: what we believed about Scripture, what constitutes Scripture, and what that meant to call something Scripture. What was our understanding of God? And closely tied into that, to what extent can humans become deified, be gods, however you want to phrase it? What did we believe about Jesus, especially in relation to the threeness of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which we both agreed on, but how are those 3 related? And then what we took to be the most important of all, and the climactic topic, because all eternity depends on it, is how does one acquire salvation, and what does salvation mean? What is entailed by that? And what does that mean for one's life when one makes that decision to follow Jesus? We wound up with a structure where we would alternate who would go first, and then each of us on each topic would do 3 things, and that formed the subheadings for our half chapters. We would try to state not only what we believe personally, but simply summarize briefly what our respective communities believed, what was acceptable diversity and what wasn't. Things we had learned about each other, mistaken views that we had discovered the other side had of us sometime, and maybe not Stephen and I with each other, but other people that we had met. And then thirdly, lingering doubts. Popularly, the way we phrased it is why I haven't converted on this topic yet. And then at the almost insistence of the publisher who finally agreed to publish this, University Press, a jointly authored concluding section to each chapter and a jointly authored conclusion to the whole book, where we had to come to wording that we could agree on, accurately represented our agreements and our disagreements. I think I probably need to say that a second time because it's a little complicated. We had to agree about where we agreed and where we disagreed. Well, that's simple. Not. Because each of us, I think, wanted to make what we agreed on the biggest part. And yet it was like, no, we can't include that, as one of us was drafting a version of one of the conclusions. You remember I said this, and he would say the same thing, but I think we did it. I think it was fair, and then it got published.
I want you to comment that, but I just want to say what's fascinating about that is that what you were forced to do, because it was ultimately going to be written down and stated very clearly in black and white, the nuance behind it is maybe lost, that there was this back and forth, this constant, hey, wait a minute, I didn't, and I'm not ready to say that yet, or da-da. And I think that just speaks to the fact that in relationship, we don't formally write out our agreements and disagreements every time with an individual, but we nuance that. We talk about it. We go back and forth. Okay, maybe I overstated that. Okay, well, can you clarify that? And what we've done with dialogue over the last 25 plus years, whether it's scholars or university students or LDS leaders and evangelical leaders, is to create that environment where the nuance and the back and forth and well, clarify that for me. Okay, now I understand that. I mean, some of our evangelical college students, we've been doing this for 22 years. They were just here in March. And at the beginning of the week, our evangelical college students from, Westmont College or Azusa Pacific or, from where we had 8 different universities represented with 85 different evangelical students meeting for 2 weeks. And they would say, like on day one, I don't think there's many differences between us and them. They seem to agree with everything we come up with. And there's, and I said, well, this is new and you're at level 1. Tomorrow you'll go to level 2 and Wednesday you'll go to level 3. And by the end of the week, they would say, man, I've learned so much. There are some really significant differences because they earned the right and they kind of achieved the trusting interaction where they could begin to talk about the similarities and differences without offense and kind of really learn enough to be able to say, okay, I see some of the differences. And by the end of the week, it was just a fascinating process for me to see them go from, boy, we certainly agree on so much, and then kind of over the different experiences come away with the understanding of some of the differences.
Correct me if you think I'm wrong, because you've done this a whole lot more than I have, but my memories of the very first experiences with that dialogue would have been that it would have been more common for the students to come in having already been told and therefore believing that they would find lots of differences, and over the course of a week be surprised that there were similarities, that there were points of agreement. But a lot has changed in 30 years.
Yeah.
I think, one of the things I'm hearing from you is there's this underlying humility that you're coming in with, that, when we have a lot of head knowledge, which would have been easy for someone like you to do, as a New Testament scholar, to come in feeling like, I know this stuff, I know this doctrine, but to come in humbly and say, I want to learn from this man what he believes, and I want to have a genuine relationship with him. And then it was a risk for you to then put it out in the public. Like that. What was some of the responses that you got from people, and did those responses change your relationship with him?
With Stephen, after the book came out, there certainly were plenty of people who were amazed, were thrilled, were congratulatory, who said, thanks for doing this, thanks for being willing to stick your neck out. But there were certainly critics as well. In the evangelical world, there were people who said, I just can't believe that Robinson's telling the truth, or if he is, then he must be some kind of dissident on the verge of excommunication, both of which turned out to be wildly false. But the comments directed toward me tended to be, I think of one person who I won't name, but he was a former teacher of mine. I respected him very highly, and he had been nothing but supportive throughout my career and my work, who said, some conversations are very important, and they're better left, at least at the time, kept privately and not published. And I thought, okay, I know what he thinks of this this book. Over time, I came to believe he was wrong, but I also understand why at the time he could have thought that. There were people that graded against everything that education means in my world. Coming from a family of public school teachers, not just my parents, but an aunt, a grandmother, a grand aunt, and there were people out of the evangelical world, some of whose names would be well recognized in Utah, who said, no, it's too confusing for people to hear about everything that you agree on. You should just focus on where you disagree. And I thought, yes, if I were an indoctrinator, that would be true. If I'm an educator, that just is wrong from every possible angle.
Yeah, I think, what Jill has said in relationship to the ongoing appeal that we're making to our audience here on Building Bridges with Greg and Jill is that to be a listener, to be humble enough, to have some appreciation, or as one Lutheran bishop once said, to have a little holy envy for somebody else's perspective, appreciation there, like, I like how the Catholics do that, or I like how the Jewish community does that. Or I'm not ready to commit, but I can extend some word of affirmation or appreciation. But I think that the piece where what you're addressing right there is that somehow if you concede anything or show some deference to an opposing view, that somehow you're embracing the whole view, right. That it's an all or nothing proposition, and we're about winning the argument. As John Stackhouse used to say, it's not about winning the argument. We're sometimes so busy about winning the argument or wanting to win the argument that we lose the relationship and don't seem to care about that. So I think what we've seen in the Mormon evangelical dialogue over the last 25, 30 years with these different examples is a growing appreciation to say there are some things that we do agree on that we can be complimentary towards or agreeable about and create some relationship, as opposed to just making our two positions as far apart as they possibly can be, to keep things very black and white, to know that we're on this side, they're on that side, we have the truth, they don't. And that can go either way. There's mentality on both sides like that. But I think to be able to really to gain a relationship and a friendship, that kind of humility, that kind of listening, that kind of openness to the possibility that this person, he's a member of that particular faith, but he may not be lock, stock, and barrel in every way. And I should actually ask him what he or she believes right. about their belief system, about these important topics like, who is Jesus? Who is God? What does it mean to be saved? What is it? I mean, there are so many things that we run around the spiritual mulberry bushes, as one author once put it, and we just waste a lot of time. In my memory, in How Wide the Divide, the things that oftentimes you were most criticized for were those concluding summaries.
Yes.
Because people wouldn't read the content of your chapter. They just go right to the summary and kind of think that they had it all figured out, and they just lambaste you for these agreeing statements. Is that fair? I mean, is that correct?
Yes, it is. And as a scholar who has to survey a ton of research for anything that I write, I'm as guilty as anyone of going straight to the conclusion, reading it, and deciding, is this significant enough that I need to read more? But this was something that was significant enough. If you're going to criticize it, you really do need to read the whole thing. And then there wasn't, well, we could have said IVP made us do this. We didn't. So as a result, everybody thought, oh, well, it was Blomberg and Robinson's idea to come up with these jointly authored conclusions. Like, no, we probably wouldn't have been that bold to think we could do it, but they made us do it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, as we wrap up this conversation, it's been fascinating. But I think what you're saying about reading a book plays into our relationships as well, that we don't go straight to our own conclusions of what a person believes or what they're saying, but we take the time in those relationships to understand, to ask those questions, to humbly enter into a relationship and not drawing conclusions based on our own judgments and our own experiences.
When Jill and I began our first pastoral ministry together as husband and wife, one of the points that our senior pastor that we worked under, Scott McKinney, used to say is that when people come to Utah, particularly Utah County, as we were serving in Orem at the time, there's kind of three basic reactions that an evangelical will have to living in Utah County, moving in from some other part of the country. And that would be, number one, you when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Join the Mormon church, fit in, belong, let your kids have friends, and stop, don't examine the differences, just join.
Right.
Number two is be so uncomfortable living here and feel like it's so foreign that you take the first job transfer you can possibly get and get out of this crazy place called Oz, Or third, you hunker down, you create a fortress, and you fight. You battle day in and day out against the opposition. And Scott McKinney, to his great credit, used to always say, there's a fourth option. There's creating relationships. There's joining the conversation. There's being engaged. Even as a religious minority in a religious majority culture, you have a voice. Use it. Don't walk around with that perpetual chip on your shoulder and everybody's against me and nobody's nice to me. And just try to change the dynamic. And I think that paradigm, 30 plus years ago when I first came to Utah, there were a lot of pastors and spiritual evangelical leaders that said, it's us and them. It's fight or die. It's conquer or be conquered. And I would say that the vast majority of evangelical leaders feel like building relationships, cultivating conversations with ecclesiastical leaders, community leaders, people within their church community. As more and more LDS people are just showing up, checking out an evangelical church service, it's more comfortable, it's more engaging, there's a conversation that's happening. And I really feel Utah is a better place today than it was 30 years ago. There's more diversity here. There's more openness, the conversations. And we end up, if we just really would take it, at face value, we become a richer, more complete human being when we can appreciate somebody else's point of view and not just dismiss them on every point. Again, you don't have to believe something to be appreciative or respectful or kind. I mean, Jesus calls us to respect and love one another. And when we do that, it creates better relationships. And Bob Mill and I said this all the time. We can much more easily talk about our differences as friends than we can as adversaries. If we're adversaries, we just won't even give up any ground. But as we're friends, we can say, okay, Bob, good point. That is a good point. I'll rethink that. And vice versa. Bob could say, okay, Greg, you got a point. I remember when I asked him about the purposes of temples as it related to salvation. Are temples not necessary, Bob? Isn't that a work that you have to go to a temple? He said, that's a great question. Give me a few days on that. And he came back and he said, this is how I feel. He said, I feel I go to the temple not to earn credit from God. I go to the temple to express my worship and appreciation and serve the Lord. And so I don't think it's a good work. I think it's something I want to do. And I thought, well, that's a different perspective than I thought the average Latter-day Saint had, and I gave him credit for his perspective. And Any final thoughts, Jill? Or
This has
comments?
been a great conversation. I actually feel like we should have planned a part 2. There's so much that has happened since How Wide the Divide has come out. 27 years, and it's actually out of print.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's copies around that you can get.
We'll provide copies forever, right?
Yes, but I'd love to have that
Maybe
further
not quite.
I'd love to have that further conversation at some point
Yeah.
to say what are some of the things that have changed since the book has come out, and maybe we'll
Do
schedule
you have any?
another
Do you have any
podcast.
sense of how many?
Colorado is really close to Utah.
And we have Zoom too. Do you have any sense of how many copies of How Wide the Divide were sold or published?
When I was writing my first couple of books, I started paying attention to those kind of statistics, and at some point it was like, why am I doing this? It's never going to be comparable to Tom Clancy or John le Carre or the really well-known authors, and so sadly, no, I don't have any
Somebody
idea.
out there can Google it and put it in the comments.
I don't know if it's something you can even Google.
20
but-
years of publications, right? 24.
right?
I mean, I'm more than 100,000 copies, right? Wouldn't that be fair to say easily?
Possibly,
Yeah.
yeah. A few thousand each year. Not sure how to define few.
Yeah. Well, a lot. I think a lot of How Wide the Divides are out there in the world, and we would encourage our viewers and listeners. We would encourage you to get on Amazon and check out a copy. And one of the coolest things you can do with Dr. Blomberg and Dr. Robinson's book is get it, buy 2 copies, give one to your LDS or evangelical friend, and use it as kind of a, hey, why don't you read a chapter? I'll read the same chapter, and next week we'll talk about it, and then we'll go. So I think you can really use that book conversationally and topically, because really those 4 issues are still the most important 4 issues, even this day. It hasn't changed because they're the core of the gospel. They're
Yeah.
the core of what we would understand who God is, how do we have a relationship with him, and where does the authority come from? Those are the quintessential issues that still need to be discussed and are being discussed. And we have a very exciting event taking place later this year that's going to bring some senior evangelical leadership into a conversation with senior LDS leadership. And we're hoping for great things to come from that interaction, where it's not just a kumbaya moment, like, oh, isn't it wonderful that we're all the same? No, let's talk about some of the differences and be good with that and see where that takes us. So I think How Wide the Divide, Dr. Ronald Enroth from Westmont College, who recently passed away, put right on the cover of that book, this is a landmark book. And I've always described How Wide the Divide as a landmark book because it was the first ever where a very, very respected evangelical scholar and LDS scholar took the time, made the effort to have a conversation that people could listen in on and have a conversation about. And I really think that we can't underestimate its influence and your contributions, both of your contributions, to what is happening today in the Mormon evangelical Latter-day Saint culture world. Really, I think books kind of go out of date and whatnot, and people don't remember the titles and whatnot. But the legacy of How Wide the Divide is undeniable.
Well, you're very kind, but I have to share a story from my own teaching ministry in a class recently that was almost entirely made up of millennials. Sometimes I get older people in classes too, but this one I didn't. Millennials have no idea what kumbaya means.
You tried to use that phrase? And
I did.
Whoo, right over their head. Yeah, isn't it interesting that you have to say, we used to write letters, they were written
I know.
things, or we used to have telephones in our house where we had a cord,
right.
and all those kind of things.
Used to do this to symbolize a phone. Now the kids do this.
One last thing I would just say, one of the highlights for me with How Wide the Divide and kind of, being a catalyst for it through that panel, and then eventually the publication of it, you had just spoken at BYU. It was in the spring of '97. You didn't have the book wasn't published yet, but you had spoken at BYU, and you wouldn't let me, and you wouldn't figure out a way to get me permission to attend your presentation. You were such a courteous guest at BYU that you could not get a spot for me at that place. I was kind of frustrated with you at the time. Eventually, Dr. Robinson, as you said, would go to Denver Seminary, and I thought for sure I can travel over there. I'm a grad. I was involved. I was denied access by Dr. Clyde, our president, Clyde McDowell. He was so nervous about having an actual real-life Latter-day Saint on campus.
I don't think I ever knew that.
So I missed both meetings. Eventually, the first meeting I got to was when Dr. Emeritus showed up at BYU at Stephen Robinson's invitation to talk about the Melchizedek priesthood. But I digress. So that when you spoke there, Robinson brought you to Salt Lake, and we met at the Salt Lake Temple on the grounds of Temple Square, and that was the transition. And so that was the first time I personally met him. I had talked to him on the phone so many times, and that is where you guys shared with me. And I remember you said we were sitting on a planter, and we were talking, and you said, "Well, Steve, should we tell Greg that we've decided to dedicate the book to him?" So you were kind to dedicate to Pastor Greg Johnson, whose initial interest led to the writing of this book. And that really opened up a lot of doors for me. But I remember that as you shared that, and I kind of was like shocked and surprised and so honored, that Robinson said something, and this is just the personification of Steve Robinson. "I don't really feel comfortable here at Temple Square." And I said, "What do you mean? This is your spot. This is the temple. I'll get a Latter-day Saint say it." He said, "I think it's a lot of propaganda here, and making all these missionaries, give the speech and give the spiel. I just don't feel comfortable here." He said, "I'm ready to go." And I was like, "Man, that guy's honest." I mean, he just kind of felt it was like a tourist attraction, and he wasn't vibing with it so much. And anyways, getting to know him, and a few other comments. There was a quote one time. He says, "Well, if after all these conversations, Greg, the evangelicals don't think we're Christians, they can just go to, HE double hockey stick." And I said, "Wow, okay," but again, it wasn't nasty.
Malicious.
It was kind of a funny way of him just saying some blunt things. So we remember him fondly today in our podcast, and his contributions as well. The parable of the bicycle. Who will forget that? So, okay, Dr. Blomberg, thank you for joining us on Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. We enjoyed having our audience with us this month, and hopefully you found this podcast informative and helpful. Go ahead and share it, like it, subscribe if you can to our podcast, and give us some feedback. We love to hear what you're thinking about our conversation that we're having with our guests. So thanks. We'll see you next time on Building Bridges with Greg and Jill.